I know we did this on the first day, but um, being a Métis person, and we often introduce ourselves, but we also do our land acknowledgement. I'm going to do another land acknowledgement, but I'm going to do it in Cree. The Native American languages of Canada in particular, we like to think, the land that we are on know our language. And so even though we did it on the first day in English, I'm just going to repeat it in Cree so that there's a relationship between myself and the land. So kakiao omatake tapete imoyak ekwa mina kaki nanaskomoyak taepe mama wintayak ota Dakots, Anishinaabe, Ekwa Mississauga, Ekwa Haudenosaunee, Egwa Mina Wendat, Aski, Anots, Kawichi, Mama Winamak, Ke Pimatisoinau. And so basically what I just said is the same kind of land acknowledgement, but with the added bit that we are all grateful to be able to also congregate together and share this space and share this land. And all the wonderful stories that have come before, and all the wonderful stories that are going to continue to be had and told about this experience and about where we're at. So with that, To'au, welcome. And Tonse, John Corbett Ntsikusun, Nia Apatawakosasan. My name is John Corbett, and I am a Métis. I'm a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta. Nia nehiyaw napeo ekwa nakao napeo eka ekayesu. I am of Cree and Soto descent and English. English is primarily on my grandfather's side of my father. My mother's side is primarily Ukrainian. I don't know the word for Ukrainian. I do know its translation though. So there's communities in Alberta that refer to the Ukrainian people as the blue-haired lady people, which refers to the babushkas, right? The blue hair that they have. Amiskwacis Waskaganokgochinia. I was born in Edmonton, and I currently live in Kelowna, BC, where I'm just completing my dissertation. That's at the intersection of computer science, Indigenous studies, and fine art. And with that, Kinanas Golmitin, I'm very grateful to be included in this wonderful week of engaging talks and included among so many great speakers. It's a very humbling experience for me. This, just so you're aware, I love vintage things, and I love vintage computing magazines. So this is a computing magazine that I created in Photoshop. You can't actually buy this, but I made it look like you could, right? Complete right down to my Casual Islands name label there at the bottom. My mail label says Casual Islands, not causal. So one of the first things, actually, I should mention, you'll also notice I put up here the past of computing instead of the future of computing. And the reason for that is in Western models, we look at past, present, and future, and time is a commodity, right? Time is money. In Indigenous models, time doesn't have a commodity attached to it. And as a matter of fact, time is a simultaneous event that includes past, present, and future kind of all happening simultaneously at the same time. And we typically look at time from a future, present, past model, where our future is continually being revealed and therefore is immediately present and then immediately in our past, if you translate it into a Western model. And what that does is it allows us to reinterpret our past. So our past is actually ahead of us, because every time that the future is revealed, it gives us a better understanding of where we came from in our past. So I like to use the story of, when I was 25 years old, I started programming when I was 10. And when I was 25, I took a job programming logistics databases. And I thought back to, all of these 15 years of playing with the computer, and look where it's gotten me. I'm going to be this technician, and I'm going to retire at 65 as, an IT manager or something, managing databases. And that is not where I ended up. And, here I am another 25 years later, and I look back to when I was 25 and going, all these experiences that I've had as they came about made me realize that maybe those choices I made through my teen years and taking that first big technology job led to this particular point. So I'm now reevaluating my history. The events themselves occurred, but my interpretation of those events, because of the way time works, my past is actually, or my future is just a reimagining of what everything has come to and how I reinterpret my past. We also talk about time immemorial, which is it's the continued occupancy of the lands on which we kind of started on. Although I was born in Edmonton, I grew up in Kelowna, and Kelowna has had a very strong pull for me, and that's where I learned how to compute. That's how I learned how to paint and draw. My academic practice up until a few years ago was predominantly art-based, so painting, drawing. I have a BFA and an MFA. And I didn't start to merge, my computer knowledge with my artistic knowledge until more recently, past 6 or 7 years. And that's kind of where this talk is going to come from. It's a little bit intimidating because I know almost everybody here is immersed in some form of technological, so you're going to understand a lot of jargon. I'm going to do my best to undo all of that and kind of twist things around a little bit. Because Indigenous perspectives don't necessarily follow those Western models. So what I'm going to do is first introduce some of the, Western models in terms of, what does culture mean in computing, and what is decolonizing computing? What are these things? And then I'll lead into a little bit more in depth on the work that I do in that decolonization effort and how you apply Indigenous knowledge in computing. So first I wanted to bring up just a couple quick, definitions. You'll come across culture-agnostic in computer science, and that typically refers to a system or application that is naturally intuitive or accessible to other users. And it doesn't necessarily mean your cultural background is not really relevant. But the ability for an application to function independent of the system that it works within is also culture agnostic, right? So being able to port code from one system to another is a way of explaining culture agnostic within a computer system. Another term that you'll come across is cultural neutral. So cultural neutral is about promoting diversity and inclusion in computer science, and being mindful of the potential biases that are in technology, and actively working to create technology that is inclusive and equitable. So those are very overarching, ideals. They are, utopian in nature, but all of these are still shaped by the values and the perspectives of the people who create and use that technology. And so we'll always hear, we want our technologies to be user-driven or something like that. And so in an Indigenous community, you want it to be indigenously promoted and indigenously created. So it's built for and by the people that are going to actually use it. And so because of that, it's always got to be shaped in some form or another by those perspectives, right? By those people that are building it. So again, not culturally neutral, technically speaking. Which brings me to cultural computing. So this is a way of taking, Western computing methods and taking ideas from culture and kind of blending those two together, using cultural inspiration to enhance digital practice, whether we use images or music, sound, there's scripture. I do beadwork, so a lot of my work derived or kind of initiated when I was translating my beadwork into a program, as well as religious and spiritual activities. And so I include some recommended reading because I don't necessarily have the time to cover all of the people that have inspired me through my journey. And so you'll see these little recommended readings at the bottom, and which are good starting points on each of these topics. That brings me to decolonial computing. And so this is actually a quote from Syed Ali's paper, A Brief Introduction to Decolonial Computing. And so he basically asks, how can computing be colonial if we live in a post-colonial world, right? And he goes on further to say that it's about interrogating who is doing computing, where they're doing the computing, and thereby what computing means to both epistemologically and ontologically. To add to that, if you're doing it with an indigenous focus, you have to add axiologically as well. What is the value, right? Is there a cultural value attached to that? And then there's branches that come out of decolonial computing that kind of became their own thing. So we have something called ethno-computing that was, I guess, started just at the turn of the century, turn of the millennia. Matty Tedre, his paper on ethno-computing really introduced kind of an extension of ethnomathematics, which I believe Ron Eglash had started, and a whole umbrella under the ethnosciences, right, where they're taking cultural perspectives and they're starting to apply those to Western models of science and technology. And some of those topics are, counting, sorting, locating, design, play theory, metaphors and relationships. What all these mean are, if you were to, for example, go to Pacific Islands and you find a little village of islanders that are fishermen, and you say, well, I need to know your number system because I want to build a mathematical model using your number system. Chances are they'll have 22 to 26 numbers. They'll have numbers 1 through 10. They'll have numbers possibly up to 20. And then they might have a couple of numbers after 20 that just mean more or a lot more. So 20 is usually, it's a 520 system in a lot of indigenous communities around the world, because we have 5 digits on each hand and each foot. And a representation of 20 would just be a person. And so in a lot of petroglyphs, rock carvings, old versions of recording history by those communities will typically show a hand when they're counting things. When there's 5 of something, they'll have a drawing of a hand or something that represents a hand. And a count of 20 would be an entire person. So if you had to have 45, if you wanted to represent the number 45, you'd have 2 people and a hand. So if you have that type of a number system, then how do I compute something that's in the millions, or even a decimal for that matter, right? How do I break that number down? Those are barriers to translating indigenous knowledge into computing ideas. Which brings me to indigenization. This is I think it's an amalgamated, the definition I kind of put together from a couple different sources. A lot of it is led by Glenn Aikenhead. He's an educator from the University of Saskatchewan, professor emeritus now, and he's retired. I highly recommend reading anything he's written about Indigenous, especially Indigenous knowledge in Western science. He did a lot of work with elementary and post-secondary students, education, and teaching of using Indigenous knowledge within science and what that actually means. And Indigenization is just that process of promoting and elevating the cultural, economical, and political status of Indigenous peoples and their and their societies. This is just privileging Indigenous over Western models, right? That's all that means. I do a little bit of this, and part of my talk, the title Indigitalization, I'll define a little later, but it uses this as its kind of foundation. But it's not just a matter of putting this into a digital perspective. There's a little bit more to it. So when I get there, I just wanted to pause right here about cultural appropriation. This is something I was horrified to find out that I did myself, and I didn't even know it. And a lot of us, I think, would do it without even realizing it. It's shown up in schools a lot. One of the examples is going back to Glenn Aikenhead. He provided this example of a math teacher that was in an art gallery, an Indigenous art gallery, saw this wonderful painting, and on that painting were this pattern of birds, right, that appeared up in the sky. And reading the artist statement, you find out what community the artist was from, what their background is, and what the meaning of the painting was, right? The meaning of the painting, what these birds represented, what the formation represented, what it told us about the land, what it told us about that particular era of the year, right? What part of the year did it occur? So there's a lot of knowledge within the painting that's captured in the painting. Now that teacher goes to school and says, "This is fantastic. I'm a math teacher. I can use this as an example." And she would go to class and say, "Hey, students, look at this wonderful painting that I found in this gallery. It's an Indigenous artist. They are from this community. And look at all these birds and how they represent tessellation." And that's where the appropriation happened. The teacher inadvertently, without even knowing, stripped out all the meaning of the knowledge that went into the development of the painting, ignoring the artist statement, and immediately applied this Western idea of a tessellation on the painting, right? That's not to say we can't use examples like that to say, hey, this is a great example of what in Western terms we would call a tessellation. However, in their culture, this is what it represents, and make sure that you include both of those side by side. And sometimes we don't, and I have done this myself. I was fortunate enough in my second year of trying to learn my heritage language of Cree, nehiyaw. And I was invited to sit in on a pipe ceremony. Now, typically, pipe ceremonies in the community that I belong to are for women only, unless they're led by a male elder, and it's for another purpose. They are healing ceremonies predominantly used for women. But I was allowed to sit in on it, and I got to the end, and I leaned into the elder, and I said, computationally speaking, this whole pipe ceremony thing is a looping algorithm, right? It's just a sequential loop. Like, we go around in the circle and we do these activities. And she looked at me and said, no, you can't think of it like that. That was my naive, brain trying to make sense out of this new experience and trying to apply a computational method to it. And by doing so, I stripped out the whole meaning of what that pipe ceremony actually means and what it does. All right, so now we're going to get to the good stuff. This is the part that I like the best. My nehiyaw example. So nehiyaw is the Cree word for Cree. The word Cree actually comes from the French word Cree, which is when the French voyageurs back in the day first encountered our people. Cree like to yell and scream like right, and they have this vocalization of welcoming, and you'll hear it at powwow dances and in our music. And so the French would, la Cree, right? And so we got called the Cree because we were the crying people, the people with crying for happiness, I guess, crying for joy. And but nehiyaw actually comes from two words in Cree called nehiyaw, which is the number 4, and meow, which is body. So we are the 4-bodied people, or the 4-spirit people. And those 4 spirits are physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. And typically, you'll see medicine wheels, right? They always have 4 compartments, 4 colors, the 4 directions. All the wheels are different, though, so you have to understand wheel theory, Indigenous wheel theory, in order to understand what those. And a lot of those are taught in community by the elders. Some communities don't even use them. So I always hesitate to use them. I don't use them in my own work, but the 4-bodied people makes a lot of sense and why it's applied to that particular model. So I'm going to start with where my work kind of originated. So as I said, I'm an artist. I've exhibited this particular work that you're seeing here, the digital version, not the physical version, was displayed at the Smithsonian in New York, in Manhattan, back in 2017, 2018, I believe. And what happened was, during my master's degree, I wanted to create these works of art in beadwork to, again, kind of bring back culture into the family, so my kids could grow up understanding the culture of my grandparents. That was kind of lost, right? Our generations just got so far, and my grandmother chose not to register with the under the Indian Act, which is why we're considered Métis, and she tried her best to homogenize with the Canadian ideal. Permed her hair and dressed in Western clothes, and just tried to downplay her Indigenous. And so I wanted to bring that back. I wanted to honor, that culture. So I thought, if I rendered all my kids in beadwork, this would be great. And as I was beading, this is the second portrait. The first portrait took me so long to do. I'm like, there's got to be an easier way, because a lot of it is thinking, okay, what color do I use and where do I put that next? And I go, can I just write a program? I'll just write a program, make me the pattern, and I can just do the pattern. Took me half the time. So this is a portrait of my son, Luke, both the digital output as well as the physical output. That digital output, that crease in the middle, is actually because it's being projected onto a cow hide. So a lot of my family are farmers, and so we are not hunters. We were agriculture. And so when I projected those portraits, I put them on cowhide rather than deer hide, because deer hide was not something I'm known for in my family. I've only ever known cows. And so he's projected onto a cowhide, but it turned out so good. I'm like, this is amazing. The problem I had was when I was beading, one of the teachings I'm given is that your thread never ends. And so when you come to the end of the thread, as you're beading, you tie a new piece of thread to that old piece of thread and you continue beading. So the thread never actually breaks, right? So there's a continuous thread that connects every single bead in that work. And if you look at the back, here you can see it kind of does the serpentine look, and where the thread comes down at the end, gets to the end of a row, drops down a row, and goes back the opposite way. And so as I was beading, I'm like, you know what? That program I wrote doesn't really match how I'm actually beading this. So I took that original, this is just pseudocode from the JavaScript, or I guess Java, because I wrote it in processing, from a single for loop that just goes left to right, right? Goes from column 1 to the end of however many columns I need, and down each row. And I reformatted it to go left to right, and then if I was on an even number row, I would go right to left, and do this. And so programmatically, it's a representation of how I physically do it. And I thought this was fantastic. This was a great way to do it. The other thing I didn't like was the gridded pattern. That's, again, another Western construction. And so I broke it down and started making spirals. And spirals was a better metaphor, especially for life, because every day that we have builds upon its previous day. Now the challenge here was, how do I write a spiral code without using algebra? Because algebra or calculus, calculations, mathematical, formulas don't work in Cree. We don't have, that doesn't exist. It's knowledge that you use from your surrounding environment. So I tried to find the most natural way to do it. It still uses mathematics, unfortunately, because there's no way around doing it in the computer. But I wanted to break up that frame. And I'm going to play this song, just play this while I'm talking along. Play. Come on. There we go. So this is just a side-by-side of the work that I had at the Smithsonian. It actually creates portraits of the 4 generations of my family, starting with my grandmother, then it goes to my father, myself, and my son, and then loops back around to the end. And so it's called 4 generations, partly because it's live generated, so it's computationally generated. So note the portraits themselves will always be the same because it's drawn from the same photograph, but they're never the same because if you look at each of the individual beads, the next time it renders the portrait, they're completely different colors. It takes a sample from underneath the underlying image and chooses a color and then places the bead there. And so that you never get the same portrait twice. The whole work itself takes an hour and a half to play. And there's a little over 34,000 beads, 34,600, I think, and 38, somewhere in there, which just represents every day of my grandmother's life. So she died when she was in 84, I think. So this is just an excerpt that I did to give a little bit of an, evaluation of how that work kind of came to be. So as each of these portraits runs through and beads the next successive generation in its place, right? So when it gets to the end of one generation, it undoes from the eye, that window to the soul or the window to the spirit, undoes it and then starts beating the next portrait in place. And so with that, I had this great idea to move this into Cree, and wouldn't you know it, I ran into a problem because processing doesn't like syllabics. This is on the left here, what my processing script looks like when I have syllabics in there. I found out later with a lot of difficulty, you can change the font in the IDE. I didn't know it at the time. And actually, I think in processing 2, you couldn't. You were limited to 7 or 8. It was just a limitation in the system. There are 7 or 8 fonts you could pick from, and none of them had Unicode support for Cree characters. Luckily, Visual Studio, I now use, it does allow for font selection very easily, a little bit more easily. But the other problem I ran into with this, there's no monosyllabic or monospaced font for Cree. So I had to create my own that was monospaced so that things lined up nice and linearly, so I can read kind of what was going on. It's not the best solution, but there's all these seemingly barriers to am I going to be able to do this? Can I create a programming language in Cree using syllabics with the tools that are currently available? Probably yes, but it was very, very difficult. And on top of that, how do I get those characters into the system? So this is an early mock-up of what I was expecting to do. I was like, I had these mental models. I mean, I could kind of mimic JavaScript or C# or something like that. And then it would create this visual output. So it was kind of a version of processing that created visual stories. So you would code it, and it would create an animation or represent whatever the story was that you were trying to tell. And here's a 30-second model of what I thought it was going to be. So this is actually created from the code that I created from the programming language I created, which is called Achimawah. Which means stories in Cree. In English, I called it Cree Sharp because it is slightly modeled after C#, which I thought was just, Western society has this propensity for naming things that are, I guess humorous or whatever. But so yeah, this is Was a Chuck Goes for a Stroll, and it was just an animation of a raven walking, along a path. It's very, very short. And this was actually in an exhibition. I created a processing script maker for Achimo that would spit out lines of code saying make Wazagachuk fly, make him stop, make him jump up and down, make him squawk, and randomized it, and then just fed it into the computer, and it ran for 2 weeks at the Beale Center of Technology in California. Uninterrupted, and it was completely random, and it had the code and the text would appear, so it was like live coding, but it was kind of like what David had done, where he was manually downplaying the audio in his demo. The whole thing that I wrote was run by processing. Processing had full control over when and where and how to do all these actions. So this is what I wanted to do. But of course, I ran into I ran into challenges everywhere. But one of them was hardware, and that was because the language of the syllabics, Cree syllabics, don't fit or conform to a QWERTY keyboard. So why am I using a QWERTY keyboard just to get letters in? And then again, am I not just mapping I'm expected to map my cultural knowledge to this Western construction. And so I wanted to kind of try to undo that. So here's some examples. There's actually typewriters right from back in the 20s and 30s that were in use up until the 70s, I think. The Canadian government had a contract with Olivetti to create typewriters for syllabic script. And they typically followed these patterns of where the syllabics were run vertically down what columns, right? So from the number 1 down to the Z. And that doesn't really fit a format that is usable by us, because our syllabic chart kind of looks like this. It's called a Cree syllabic star chart. This is a teaching aid. So when you're learning syllabics, each of the vowel or vocalizations of the syllabics runs in one of the 8 directions. And when you compare this with an alphabet chart, for English, there's a kind of a linear, we go A to Z, right? There's an order to it. There's no real order to syllabics like if you were to start reciting syllabics, where do you start, right? If it's presented in this structure. And so if you're typing on a keyboard, where do you put the ma character or the cha character? Where do I map that on a QWERTY keyboard, right? So I had this challenge and I thought, maybe I can create a keyboard using the star chart. So my first iteration, I just went to the keyboard map maker and made a keyboard. And I loved how it turned out. I was thrilled. I think this is gonna be great. And I went to bed the night that I had created this, and I'm like, you know what? I don't like all this empty space. So maybe I just kind of tried to push those keys closer together. And I accidentally made it round. And then I realized that it's round. It's actually not a square. So this looks very squarish, probably because it's being reinforced by the M characters, which are those L's that form a box kind of right in the center. So you get this feeling of an X or a feeling of a box. But when I rounded out those keys and I realized, hey, this is actually a circle. And I just moved some of the characters that would be in the diagonals. I moved them side by side. So long as they're in the right orientation as far as their diagonal position goes, that's culturally fine, I guess. So with that, I'm super excited. Now I actually have to make the keys. So I made some 3-dimensional keys. And while I was building the keys, and I'm chamfering these edges. So I should also note that I am not a 3D designer. I don't know anything about CAD. I watched some YouTube videos and learned out how to make keys, but then I also figured out how to make them round and chamfer the edges. And so I created these, and when I was creating them, I realized I had 12 vertical poles that I had created. So these yellow stripes that are on there just indicate where there's certain vertices for the chamfering edges. And I had bisected the faces just because I wanted some sort of visual support. And I realized if I could make one more, so on the back side of the key, I actually, instead of bisecting that face, I trisected it, creating 13 poles, because there's 13 poles in a teepee. And we have the 13 pole teachings. So there's 13 teachings when you raise a teepee, and each one has its own understanding. So there's respect and reciprocity and understanding, and wakutawin, which is relationships, et cetera, right? So we have all of these ideas, and each one is a different teaching about how to be nehiyaw and the integrity that goes along with representing that. And I thought, what a great way to put this into the key, because ultimately when I'm done, that key is going to have a syllabic on top. So this teepee and these teachings are supporting that language that's now sitting on top of it, right? Skip ahead to the circuit board. So this is just a typical keyboard schematic or circuit board design. Again, I'm not an electrical engineer. Don't know anything about circuit board design. However, YouTube came in very handy for this as well. And I created my own board because my board was circular. I wanted to have these circular paths. And I was at an event in 2017, and an elder was there. And I've always taught when you go into a lodge, so when you go into a sweat lodge or into a teepee, in my culture, we would walk counterclockwise. So you come in the door usually faces east. East is where the sun rises. That's where the knowledge comes from. And so the door is always open to the east. So you come in the door and you walk counterclockwise before you find a place to sit. The elder or whoever's leading ceremony will sit facing south with the door to their east. This becomes important in a minute. And the elder at this event had told me, do you know why we do this? And why we walk around before we find a place to sit. And I said, no, this is just what I was taught, right? And he said, if you're from some of the Dene communities, Haudenosaunee, they will sometimes walk counterclockwise. So they do the same ceremony. They walk counterclockwise. And he goes, the reason for that is if we all came into the lodge and we all walked in the same direction, we would never meet anybody. You'd constantly be following somebody else. So the teaching here is that we walk our own paths according to our own communities. Even if you're in another community, you don't follow their ways. You follow your own ways, the way you were brought up. And it's a mutual respect thing, right? So there's a mutual respect for other communities, even when they're on your own, on your land or sharing your space. You don't interfere with their teachings. And it gives us a chance to meet and greet and even converse about, why do you walk this way? Or why do you walk that way? And so that resulted in this board. So all my electron flow goes clockwise because that's in Cree culture that we can do it. Now the microprocessor, which is now I use an RP. This is a teensy, but that was my first one. I now use the RP 2040. It was better, I think, at doing what I needed it to do. It's also smaller because I got it embedded onto the board instead of having to buy the actual chip. It is located to the east. Now you might be going, no, it's not. It's on the west. But this again is where you have to think a little differently. And when I said when the door to the teepee is the east, and the elder who leads ceremony sits facing south. So they sit at the north part of the teepee and they face south. So if you imagine yourself sitting at the bottom of this facing forward or up, right, what we normally call north, the direction you're facing is usually north on a piece of paper, then you're actually facing south because you're sitting in ceremony and therefore you're facing south. So south is actually at the top, north is at the bottom, east and west. And this is important because that microprocessor is acting as this conduit of knowledge, your doorway to your computer that's getting the knowledge to and from your keyboard, to the user in the chair. That's why the microprocessor has to be on the east. And it has to ceremonially be on the east, so it's actually on the left side of the board, not the right. And there's a picture of what they turned into. Now the painted one, the turtle, I hand painted that one. And then I wanted just another way of representing culture. So bear is really important in our culture as well. So I just created a wooden case for the other one. My turtle one, though, I call it my what did I call it? It's my world turtle, my turtle island, right? It's my turtle island board. So when I was assembling the boards, when I finally got all the keys 3D printed, and I was putting them on, I'm like, hey, this feels like a turtle shell, right? All these little buttons. And so I painted it. And when I show it in community, they're like, oh, it's a Turtle Island board. That's so cool. So everybody wants a turtle one. So now I'm trying to find out a way to paint all of the keys instead of by hand, but have it, printed so that it looks like that. And then I also wanted to do what I found when I was using it with two hands wasn't practical. I used it with one hand quite a bit. And it was just a little bit cumbersome to hold it next to my regular QWERTY keyboard to go between English and the syllabics. And so I figured I could try to make a hybrid. So this is just the design so far. I'm working on the circuit board. It's a little bit more advanced because I might have to use 2 processors now, just for the amount of keys. But this is what the hybrid looks like, and this hopefully for school administrators, people, the librarians that manage cultural knowledge within the schools and offices in the communities. So they don't have to skip back and forth between 2 boards. They can have a single board kind of all merged into one. Now I can finally create some software now that I have a keyboard to do it with. And so there was a lot of challenges with this, and I'm going to kind of breeze through this because a lot of it is coding related. And what I really want to get to is the abstract ideas that had to go into undoing all of my programming knowledge in order to get it. So I approached this with a huge naive idea of being able to take Cree language and put them into just get Cree words for all the technology uses that I needed, right? And then I found out that syllabics, there's no punctuation. We have 1 punctuation mark, and that's the period or the full stop. We don't have or need or use any other punctuation. I'll give you an example of how complex that can actually look. There's no monospaced syllabic fonts that were usable in the IDEs that I was trying to use, and ideas like variables, loops, and conditionals if statements were problematic because the language syntax and so the morphological syntax of Cree doesn't support conditionals. So I'll get to that. And I also wanted to use language-specific quirk, or I call them quirks, but they're interesting pieces of the language. I wanted to be able to use those. Like, for example, there's no adjectives in Cree. It's nouns and verbs. And you identify something that is blue or red or white by adding a verb. So it becomes a black bear, but that's a word, right? It's a noun. It's always a noun, even though the modifier might simulate an adjective in English. So we get to Achakapekana, which is spirit markers. So Achakapekana is the Cree word for syllabic. It literally translates as a spirit marker. That's because the language is so sacred that we have to describe it. We use it in a way that is respectful of what it actually represents to its oral equivalency, right? The best that we can in written form. Maminta Nehiyaw is a artificial brain. And I got this from an elder because the previous word, which means computer, so the original word was chiksteopitchikeo, which means a box of shadows that you write with no pen. It's very long. It's an amalgamation of the box of shadows, which is a television, and the letters or the book that you can write with no pen, which is a typewriter. So it's those 2 things put together. But we've evolved since then. However, the story, my first day of Cree learning class and the elders were, what words do you as students want to know? What are relevant to you in your current context? And of course, I was the first hands up. What's the word for computer? We don't have a word for computer. I'm in trouble. There's no word for computer, which means there's no word for network, database, mesh, relationship there is. So relational, I could get, loops, conditional statement, even just the word statement. All of these things that I would use to describe computer activities don't exist. So the 3 things I kind of broke down computing into were variables, loops, and conditionals. If I could kind of settle those out, I would be good. And at first I thought, well, what is a variable? It's just a bucket. It's a container, right? It holds things. And so I thought, well, if I just called it a basket or a medicine bag is originally what I wanted to use it, but we have berry picking baskets. So Minneswat is a berry picking basket. So I can pick berries, put them in my basket. I thought that's a perfect analogy. So this is kind of, how I'm thinking it's going to work itself out. But then I got to conditionals, and I actually have to give credit to Kari Noe from Hawaii. I met her at a conference in Vancouver. I think it was 2017 or 2018. They had a similar issue with Hawaiian. They were converting C# into Alelo Hawaiian, and they don't have the syntax of if A, then B, right? If A equals this, then do this. That syntax, they have no way of using that in their language. So they had to come up with another way. And so they consulted in the community, talked to elders, and elders said, well, aren't you really just discussing the path of a river, right? So the river goes down and it breaks into branches off into these different streams that usually come back together. And so that was their, they used the word for river. And I'm like, oh, this is brilliant. This is what I was missing in what I needed to do. Now, rivers in Cree are also very important, right? Water is life, and water is a huge component of Cree life, especially with the fishing communities. And that's part of my my ancestry. My grandfather, where he met my grandmother, was as a fishing liaison in Winnipeg or in Manitoba. So we also don't have this if. We have the same if problem. We can't say if this, then that. We would say, so the example I gave the elder was like, if it is night, then I see the moon. If it is day, then I see the sun. The response that came back in Cree, I translated back into English, was I see the moon, it is night, right? That was the translation. So I'm like, there's no if in there. Where's the if? Where's the then? There was no causality. There was no this, then that. It was a statement that that's all it was a statement. So I did the same thing. I used river, CP. Now the cool thing about Cree is that CP cis is a diminutive. Cis on the end will shrink something, and so you can use CP to start an if branch. And they can use CP cis kind of as a select or a case statement or a switch statement, right, to break down into smaller rivulets, shall we say. And I thought this was great because now I have a basket to carry stuff in down my river. Things are beginning to be very poetic. And then I came across loops, and I'm like, so now that I'm in this metaphoric mode of rethinking about, well, what is a loop, right? It's just something that's cyclical, something that happens repeatedly. This is an example in C# that I wrote to kind of give the same idea. And I do have numbers or explanations for the word random as well. But I wanted to do the same idea that the river had conjured up. And I was in class one day, and we were learning how to say our age. We talk about our age in terms of winters. We could use summers, but that would be more southern. So you see it in like old Western movies. Like, how many summers old are you, right? Because it's hot, especially like Navajo or southern states, or even South American indigenous tribes will use how many summers old are you. Where I'm from, we use winters because winters can be very harsh in Canada. And so being X winters old means that you had resilience to make it through another harsh winter, possibly with little to no food, little to few resources, especially in our, now our colonial state where the government's supposed to be providing these things for us and they didn't. And so how did we survive through a winter? So winters as a cycle is a very respected kind of idea, and thought, this is really good. The pipe ceremony thing, I can put off to the side now because I found an adequate looping condition. And so now I can, for every winter, take my basket and ride in my canoe down the river, right? And so the code has now become a poem, a way of telling a story in code that just kind of replicates another form of storytelling. Which brings me to leveraging the language, and I like this. This is the fun one in Cree is how you say hippopotamus. Hippopotami are not native to Canada, so we just describe it as we see it. And This introduces free word order, but essentially I'm going to try my best because I cannot do this without reading it off the screen. Kiche, kispaka sekewe, mistipwame maketune, niswapeteo, atemepeko, pimataka which loosely translates as great, thick-skinned, big-thawed, big-mouthed, two-toothed, underwater swimming pig. You'll also notice there's no dashes between any of the syllabics. That is one word. In English translation, we add the dashes, but because there's no syllabic for a dash, it doesn't get included. But this is that morphological syntax where we can take morphemes, attach them in a string, and it creates the word, right? And so I wanted to be able to do that. So in this case, I have a variable. I called it a tim because it kind of brings the point across. A tim in Cree means dog. So etimosis is a small dog or a puppy. So I can say in programmatically, I could say atimosis, which just means take the variable, whatever the value is in a tim, and -1 from it. I can also do the same thing for making it bigger. So mistatim in Cree means horse or big dog, depending on the context. So I can say mistatim, and it would be the same as a tim equals a tim plus 1. I could actually mix both of those together and say mistatimosis, which means pony, right? It's a horse, but small. And if I did that in code and said mistatimosis, I would actually, it's the same thing as going a tim equals a tim plus 1 minus 1. So both those calculations can happen. Now, surprisingly, I didn't account for this, but I could actually, I've done this in my code, atimosis osis, which is syntactically incorrect. Can't do that in the real language, which just basically is a tim equals a tim minus 3. It just diminutives 3 in a row. And lastly, ceremonious function, and this is smudging. So smudging is a ceremony that we have where you light some sweetgrass or sage, and you wash it over your head, your ears, eyes, your mouth, your heart. And this is a way of cleansing yourself, preparing yourself for learning, for being attentive, for speaking truthfully, and so on. And I'm like, hey, this is the same thing that happens in the computer. When you run a program, clear the cache, clear my screen, get my variables prepared, null everything out, reset the speaker if you have to. So it does all of these things that smudging does. And so ceremonially or metaphorically, it's the first line of code. So I have this first line of code called miyasake or tisamen, depending on the culture that you come from. It just means smudge. It physically doesn't have to do anything because the coding environment already prepares all of that stuff. It's more symbolic, but it's in the code and it's necessary because it's symbolically replacing that or digitally replicating that physical activity that we do. Another point on indigenization, Ojibwe elder Duke Redbird has used this term elderrhythms, which are algorithmic expressions of elder knowledge. I love this. This is something I just came across about a month ago. And this is what I'm trying to do is convince elders about how valuable the technology is, about preserving the culture, making sure that it's passed on to the next generation. Because a lot of elders in their communities are resistant to technology, especially computers, because they believe that it's diluting and taking away from the culture, that it's not helping. And I believe that it is. It has to be provided to them in the particular context, in the right context. This is a quick view of my IDE. I think I'm coming close to time, so I'm going to go through the last 3 or 4 slides. So to wrap everything up, I'm assuming everybody here knows what a framework is. So what does all of this have to do with my framework? And that is an Indigenous framework. It just uses these Indigenous ideas and these concepts to apply them to technology and our digital tools, whatever those happen to be, whether they're applications, systems, our interfaces, hardware, software, all of those has to be holistic. And by holistic, I'm referring to holistic with a W, which if you go online, there's all these things that say holistic with a W is wrong. It's the wrong spelling. It's no W. Holistic in this context means everything is considered simultaneously as a whole, as opposed to holistic without the W, which is referring to it's a collective, like all the parts of a whole, where each of those paths can be considered independently, but still considered within the holistic paradigm that they represent. Indigenous views, you have to address the whole. You can't address one little small part. You have to look at the whole system all the time. So in my case, I had to look at the hardware and the software, and now just theorizing what all of that means. And the last kind of component to that is that everything is related. And I mentioned this before as wakutawin, as the Cree word for relationships. Wakutawina. It is everything is related. Everything, every cell, every atom within us is related to every other atom in the universe in some manner, right? So we all have relationships, not only to our computers, to the land, to the air we breathe, to the food that we eat, to each other. All of these things are interconnected, universal, right? And that understanding has to be applied to the entire system. Which finally brings me to Indigitalization, which is just kind of an offshoot, but it is about braiding together these Western ideas of science and computing practices with Indigenous culture practices and worldviews. And that where Indigenization is just that process of promoting and elevating that I mentioned before. Indigitalization doesn't necessarily meaning put in Indigenous ideas above Western ideas. It's about this cohabitation and even allowing Western paradigms to be dominant so long as they don't violate or oppress cultural protocols or our underlying belief systems. And I think this is the last slide. So programming for us, because we always talk about our language is ceremony and our language is medicine. Therefore, computer programming is ceremony and computer programming is medicine. I wanted to leave with a last slide on trauma used as a framework for computing, but I think I'm going to call it right here and open the floor to questions.
This is super cool. Thank you for doing all this stuff. This is amazing. I actually, I was wondering about your IDE and the programming environments. Is this an open practice? Are you looking for outside people to learn, or is this something you're hoping to keep in communities?
I was kind of prepared for that question. So I've been struggling with this. Open source, hell yeah, like let's go open source. The problem is Indigenous intellectual property and elder knowledge. Community doesn't want their knowledge out there. So it ends up being a closed system. So when I approached the elder about sharing this online and the structures that I had made, it's a long process. And when I talk about time, there's no concept of time. And so we'll get back to you. That could be next year. 10 years from now, time is time. It's not a relevant point to the system. I'm trying to push this to open source so I can get more people in the community involved to even apply it to their own communities, because this is very Western Cree based. Eastern Cree have similar ideas but might change a few things, and so I want to use it as a model for bringing these ideas to their communities as well. But it can't happen unless it's open to everybody and that access is open. And so one of my motivations for creating the framework is to provide just some guidance as to what do we privilege, what do we don't, and how do we braid those together. So yeah.
I have some nuance here, and I get to do comment rather than question. Open source is actually the Western framework of law locking code open. I would ignore it in this context. The nuance I've come to see is that there's zero marginal cost to copying digital bits, and the important scarce resources are in fact community. I don't have an answer in there, but I think that the practice of sitting with community and not putting a license on it, because the license puts you within the realm of the Western system.
Yeah.
And if you refuse to mention it and refuse to answer the question, then people must engage with community practices, perhaps.
Absolutely. And that was a really good point, because that's throughout my PhD, I was told, make sure you're talking to elders. Like anytime I have a question, I have to run it by an elder. It feels like I'm asking my mom and dad for permission to do something. But there's a reason behind it, right? And they're the knowledge holders, and so they're the ones that I have to I don't want to say appease, but they're the ones I should be listening to. They're the ones that are teaching me through this journey that I want to be respectful of. And yeah, you're absolutely right. Any resistance to Western ways of doing, I've talked about it a number of times in this talk about we use past, we don't use future, we use this, we don't use that, right? So trying to break out some of those molds.
This is absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. Mind-blowing, in fact. Do you know of other projects, other tribes, other communities doing what you're doing?
Yeah, so of course I didn't say anything about Ramsey's work, but he was a big influence in what I've read. And the only other big project I knew was the Alela Hawaiian group. I was approached by a couple of tribes in Oklahoma that wanted to bring this system, because what they saw was a way of encoding their cultural knowledge in programmatic code that can then be, once it's been consumed and compiled, is now protected. And so they see it as a way of protecting their knowledge and still being able to share it, because it creates a visual output. So you might not know the oral history or the language that goes behind it, but you can watch the animation and enjoy or be a part of their culture and still appreciate it without them having to give away any kind of cultural knowledge. But to my knowledge, I'm the only one so far that I know of. There is Uti Leiti, who's Finnish. She's Sami. She's done a lot of work. And actually in Finland, it's mandated by the government that all coursework in high school has to be in the language. And so if you're Sami, you have to be able to take computer science in Sami, and there's no computer textbooks in Sami language. So she has that, she's trying to fight that struggle, is how do you teach something where there's no written material to support it? But yeah, I know there's some initiatives out there, not to the extent that I've addressed them, because I looked at it as it turned into a whole system. I wrote 3 dissertations, not one. So hopefully that answers it. I don't know. If anybody knows, by the way, let me know, because I'm always open to finding out more.
Hey, incredible as always. I love your body of work and watching it develop and watching you sort of take it apart. A wall that I hit in my own non-Latin programming practice is integrating with the wider ecosystem of existing software and SDKs and APIs, all of which carry English language names and the Latin, the writing system. And I actually consider that as the sort of insurmountable wall. Like, you can build your own language, you can do your own thing, but if you want to talk to the world, it's 60 years of English names. So I just wonder how you confront that, and how your language sort of builds that bridge, if it does, and what that looks like.
I actually cited that in my dissertation, by the way. So when I came across that particular, I can't remember what talk it was that you had given, and you had said, inevitably, Kolb kind of fails in this because of the history of English and its prevalence in computing languages, and you ultimately have to build with libraries that were pre-compiled or compiled in English predominantly. I gave up at that point in trying, because I think you kind of resolved it for me. I wasn't going to attempt to go any further. What I did instead was I changed my framework to allow for, as I call it, braiding, because it's not about undoing Western ideas and Western models. It's not about taking those apart and then building something that's Indigenous. It's about working with those models, and there is value in those models. I don't want to discredit or take away anything that was developed in a Western lens. What I want to do, though, is introduce these Indigenous ideas into it. And so I decolonize it or deconstruct it, introduce these ideas, and then kind of put it back together, hopefully, to use a word from the previous presentation, in harmony with one another, so that it can take it where it needs to go and be beneficial. And, one of the topics I wanted to get to was addressing trauma, because that's a huge one with Western, the way Indigenous people have been treated over the years, right? And it came out of a talk I had where somebody had said, I gave a challenge. I go, everybody give me some loops, things that are cyclical. And somebody said, intergenerational trauma. And I went, wow, that's amazing. And then I'm like, well, I don't mean amazing. Intergenerational trauma is amazing. Intergenerational, I go, that as a concept got me thinking about, if I was to make a computer programming language that its intent was to heal trauma based on this idea of intergenerational trauma, you create trauma as the loop, but then you're healing it with the lines of code that go into it. I haven't quite theorized how all that would work, but it's the next step to what I'm working on now. And that's where I want to kind of address that. I can't take the English out, but what is there in there that we can use to work together and kind of braid it so that it's a cohesive whole?
I'll take one more question.
All right.
Thank you for your talk. It's spectacular. I love your practice. Going back to the question about open access and ethical sharing, your research seems pretty exhaustive, so you probably have come across this, but just have you looked at the traditional knowledge labels project from local context? And it speaks to that notion of not trying to dismantle models, but to kind of try to kind of engage them and braid, which is like, it's more around content licensing as a kind of an alternative to that, which allows Indigenous communities to specify certain parameters of sharing and kind of build those in proactively to labeling. Right. And it's like a whole set, kind of like CC licenses, but for traditional knowledge. And I'm wondering if that's been explored in as being applied to code, and what you think of that framework in general.
Yes, kind of. There's actually a funny story behind this. So there is a namesake of mine. I call him the other John Corbett, also at UBC. He is human geography. We think we do have a common ancestor. Ironically enough, both of our dad's names is the same too. But we were going to co-author a paper because he does human geography and specifically was working on Tlingit place names in BC, and how do we map those ideas. And I wanted to do something similar for Cree and Indigenous artists, and so mapping the movement of Indigenous artists through life across time. But it meshed so well with this place name idea that he had. So I've looked at it from that perspective, is in terms of mapping and tracking Indigenous knowledge and how it migrates from place to place. And then ultimately, how do we end up referring to those places, both in their current English state, in the native language of that particular land, and how do outsiders that are non-English speaking also refer to that area, and what those geographies actually represent, and then transposing those into digital geographies and mapping those ideas in digital spaces. And I'm really intrigued by that, and I just thought it would be cool to have a paper by John M. Oh, we also have the same middle name, John Michael Corbett and John Michael Corbett. And as soon as I get my credentials, it'll be Dr. John Michael Corbett and Dr. John Michael Corbett. I've tinkered with it a little bit. I haven't done a full kind of deep dive into it, but I know what the trajectory of my current research is definitely leading in that direction. So
That was spectacular, John. Thank you so much.
thank you.
Fantastic.
Hi.